Tonight we've got Dr. Rachael Kelley, who is a research fellow who works both at the Centre of Dementia Studies at Leeds Beckett and also at the Leeds Institute of Health Sciences at the University of Leeds. We've got Dr. Jane Freeman, who is a healthcare scientist who is currently holds a clinical lectureship from the NIHR. We have Dr. Heidi Siddle, who is a podiatrist by background, who currently holds a senior clinical lectureship from the NIHR. And we have David Bird, who is a medical physicist who works at the radiotherapy department at Leeds Teaching Hospital, who is nearing the end of his CDRF PhD fellowship. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to the panel. The panel will be doing a presentation and we will be doing questions at the end of their presentation. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Carol. Hello everyone, and as Carol said, we're going to talk about preparing for an NIHR fellowship interview. I'll come on to specifically what we're going to cover in a minute, but I thought first it might just be helpful if we introduced ourselves and just explained why Carol has asked us specifically to do this session. So I'm Rachael Kelley and I've been lucky enough to have 2 NIHR fellowships. I've also recently applied for another one, a postdoctoral fellowship, which I had an interview for, but I didn't get. So hopefully you can learn from my experience of both what works and maybe what doesn't as well. And perhaps if we introduce ourselves in the order of the slide, maybe.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jane Freeman and I am a clinical scientist in microbiology at Leeds Teaching Hospitals and a clinical academic fellow at the University of Leeds now as well. And I have a clinical lectureship on the NIHR scheme, and I'm going to give you my presentation that I did for that a little later on in the session. So you'll be able to see, you know, a 5-minute presentation as it happened.
Okay, hi, I'm David Bird. So yeah, I'm a radiotherapy physicist here in Leeds, and I guess my reason for being on the panel is that maybe I'm a bit closer to sort of the junior end of the NIHR pathway, but you know I'm 2.5 years away from my interview, so at least maybe I've started getting a bit of a bit more perspective on it. So hopefully I'm close enough to be able to advise you on the starting pathway, but far enough away to have a bit more experience on it.
Hello, my name's Heidi Siddle. So my children don't currently have NITs, but I gather that there's a possibility they might do even during COVID. So anyway, apart from that, I have an NIHR senior clinical lectureship, which I started last, so a year ago, March. I held a clinical lectureship before that. And sort of pre-NIHR days, my PhD was funded by the Arthritis Research UK. I have been both unsuccessful and successful at interviews, so hopefully I can contribute to the conversation today and answer some of your questions. I'm a podiatrist by background and now have and feel very fortunate now to have a joint clinical academic contract through the University of Leeds as an associate professor and honorary consultant podiatrist. Thanks, Rachael.
Thanks, everybody. So in terms of what we're going to cover this evening, we're going to start with Jane telling us a little bit about what an NIHR fellowship interview is actually like in practice. Then I'm going to go over some top tips for doing well in a fellowship interview. Jane has then very kindly, as she said, offered to deliver her fellowship interview presentation for you all, so her 5-minute presentation, to give you an idea of actually what sort of things are looked for in a really good presentation. And then we'll move on to the question and answer session, which David and Heidi will coordinate between them. But please do feel free to post questions in the chat along the way. David and Heidi will be keeping an eye on that. So I'm going to pass over to Jane now to let her load up her slides. I'll just get you out of mine first.
Okay, so this is the tough bit where we have to try and make things work. I've turned myself off. Okay, so, right, have you got a full screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Marvellous. Okay, so I've already introduced myself, so I don't need to do that anymore. So a little bit about presentations for a fellowship. So I think that when you're applying for an award and you're putting absolutely everything that you've got into it, it's easy to imagine that your interview is actually going to look something like this, like some terrible torture chamber with awful characters who are going to try and pull you apart and tear you apart in the jaws of death. Actually, the reality is very different. And one of the many helpful things about these kinds of series of talks and the way that the ICA community in Leeds helps you prepare for this is to tell us about the actual layout of the room when you walk into it. Now, for some of you that are going for fellowships this year,
Jane, can I just interrupt you? Your slides aren't moving on.
Oh no.
Sorry.
Right.
We can, yeah,
if I just move them on, hang on, have they moved on at all?
Yeah, so we can see the third slide now.
Okay, so if I might have to just keep doing it like that. Can you see it now?
We're on the third slide still.
You might need to share the PowerPoint, like the presentation mode rather than the...
Yeah, that's what I was doing it in presentation mode. That's the slide I'm on currently.
Will it let you click up one slide? We're on the second Lego picture. Do you want us to be on the one above?
No, that's it. The second Lego picture with the with all the characters round.
Oh yeah, that's what one.
That's the right one. Okay. So I've recreated what the panel looks like in Lego here. So you have the panel in a horseshoe around you in the middle with your presentation at the desk and on a screen behind you. Now, I'm going to talk this through because it's still relevant for people going for fellowships starting to apply for fellowships. They'll need to know this. So your panel are made up of about 12 people and they have a couple of PPI representatives on there who also ask you questions. From recollection, there were about a dozen people in total, and that probably sounds like a lot, but if you know there's going to be a dozen people in there, then actually it's a lot less daunting. So this really is one of the more helpful things you can do, is be talked through the layout of the room. I'd say the PPI people were the friendliest of the bunch, for definite, but nobody was unfriendly at all. And I think that's what you have to remember. These people are here to hear what you've got to say and to make a reasonable assessment of it. And really, they're rooting for you at the end of the day. So I was brought in by Beth, who was the ICA clinical lectureship coordinator, to a desk with a laptop, and my presentation was already on the screen. You give your presentation to NIHR and they load it up. So she introduced me and I was allowed to sit or stand as I felt comfortable. And I elected to stand, having been told a horror story by a friend about someone who sat during an interview with crossed legs, and they were so tense that when they tried to get up to leave, their legs were dead and they had to crawl out of the room. And so I played it pretty safe. Right, I've moved on slides. Can you see a new slide? No. Whoops.
I think, yes, we can now. We can see you in front of the screen. Is that right?
On. That's my slide with the little Lego woman in front of the screen.
Yes, we've got that.
Great. So I gave my 5-minute presentation and they're pretty strict on the 5 minutes. They will cut you off if you don't hit the time right. And this was, to be fair, the only time I actually hit the time right. And then it's 20 minutes of questions. And one of my tips is that the presentation is really good for calming you down, because it's a part of the process that's entirely under your control. You've done all the work in the preparation beforehand, and by the time the interview comes round, you will know it backwards and inside out, particularly the first 30 seconds. And in my experience, this is about the amount of time it takes for you to start settling down into the process. After you've done your presentation, you then get about 10 minutes questioning on your project and 10 minutes on your training plan. My first question was a complete curveball, and it had very, very little to do with my project. But what I had done was some reading around the panel the CL panel beforehand and kind of had a couple of likely candidates who might be my lead inquisitor. So I knew that this was a possibility and I wasn't thrown by it. It went by in an absolute flash. It really does. And I had no idea how I'd done on the day. And you'll find this too. You're far, far too close to it at that point to make a rational assessment of how you've done. So my advice is to give yourself a day or two to let your brain chew it over a bit and then try and forget about it. I know that's easier said than done. Right, I'm going to change slides. Do we have a change of slide? Not yet.
It hasn't changed yet, but I wonder if it just takes a bit of time.
I do. Give it 2 seconds. Not yet.
No.
Okay, I'll go back and move
Yeah,
on.
there we go.
Oh, it's gone. I think I need to click off it each time, actually. Okay. Feedback, which is what everybody's kind of waiting for. It's what you yearn for on the day and will not get till later. You get nothing from the panel on the day. When you're practicing your interviews, sometimes you get a little bit of eye contact with people and it's encouraging, but not on the day. They give you nothing. You might get a little bit from the PPI group, but nothing else. Don't read anything into that. It means nothing. They're just being dispassionate. There's quite a wait for the results, and there was a lot of refreshing of emails over Christmas, even on Boxing Day by me. But when the feedback comes, it is really good from NIHR. Whether you're successful or not, you get some brilliant feedback. So you can expect that. And I think that's really excellent. You get it whether you're successful or not. I've been in research for quite a while, so I'm used to knockbacks and I don't really take it personally. And that's one of the things you need to remember. And it's also worth remembering when you're giving your presentation that the reviews are opinions. They are the opinion of individual peoples. And so when they come back, they might differ considerably. I had 4 reviewers, 3 really liked me, 1 didn't even want to give me a short list. So you'll find all the feedback is useful in some way. I'll just move on. Have you got a change? Have you got a Dragon Hunter book? Okay. Yeah. So thinking about what I wished I'd known before the interview, there's really only one thing that I wished I'd realised, and that was that there are 2 Hilton hotels in Leeds where the interviews were scheduled for, and the one I went to first doesn't hold NIHR interviews. So first tip, make sure you're going to the right place. But in all seriousness, for me, it was more like things I'm glad I learned from the interview. And this was largely down to the preparation that we got from this kind of environment and from all the other team of NIHR followers who kind of feed into it. And one thing I would say is talk to as many people as possible. And that goes not just for interviews, it goes for the whole process. Talk to anyone you can. So I learned that the interview is like a Dragon's Den pitch, actually, rather than an interview. You are pitching your idea and asking them for their investment. And what they want to know is whether their investment is safe with you. So this is my son's Dragon Hunter book that he made to help me illustrate some of the more helpful things. As I've said, you can look up who's on your panel, and that's really helpful to give you an idea of who might be doing most of the questioning of you. 2 of them are going to lead on your application. The rest of them won't have read it quite as thoroughly as they will. You can probably have a good guess about who they're going to be. And it's worth looking them up on the internet to see what their research interests are and also what they look like. And so if you walk into a room and you see them, you're not fazed by it. It's about kind of taking that sense of nervousness down. And remember that the panel are people who do this because they strongly believe in clinical academic careers. They're also people, they're not actual dragons. They have either 2 long days ahead of them or 2 long days behind them. And I don't know about you, but I would really welcome a friendly smile and a hello and a line about how pleased you are to be there, because you are. Also, because their people are not actual dragons, they'll have been where you are before and they'll experienced awful times where you forget everything, we get terribly nervous. So having a wobble is not the end of the world. Saying, I just need a moment is fine, or I just need to, can I just have a drink of water? That's fine, everybody needs that. And the last thing that I would say, actually on this slide still, is make sure you've got plenty of energy, because it really takes it out of you. And if you've got, some of you will have interviews at lunchtime, make sure you have something to eat an hour beforehand, because you don't want to be hit with a huge sugar rush so that you're falling asleep. But likewise, you need the energy to be able to think on your feet and respond. For me, I was very fortunate and was successful at my interview. And I have to say, looking back on it, it was an enjoyable process. I enjoyed the questions and talking about my research. And I hope that this has been in some way useful to you. And I'm always happy to answer questions, but I'm going to hand over to Rachael now.
Thank you, Jane. I completely agree with everything you said. Lots of what you've said mirrored my experience as well. So it's really interesting to hear that. I also had the same experience of someone not liking me at all as well. I think I had my career potential rated, you can rate it 1 out of 5 or something like that. It was either 1 or 0 from somebody, so that was nice. Hopefully you can see the next set of slides now. I'm just going to cover a few top tips for the presentation first, and then a few top tips for the interview. So this time around especially, so if you're having an interview this time around and it's going to be online, then your slides are going to be mainly what they're looking at. So if you think about how you're looking at this now, you can see predominantly my slides, and then I'm probably a little square in the corner somewhere. So normally in a face-to-face interview scenario, I'd be moving around, pointing at my slides, being quite enthusiastic. Actually, the focus for them is predominantly likely to be on your slides, because you're only going to be small in the corner. So it's particularly worth thinking about what you put on your slides, I think. Some general tips would just be to keep wording and diagrams as clear, as simple as possible. No jargon, because not everybody on that panel, or most people on that panel, will not have expertise in your particular area. Do really use visual aids and pictures, but make sure they're relevant and helpful to what you're trying to say. But they will be something that they're looking at a lot while you're talking, so do really be mindful of what things you use and make sure they enhance what you're saying. Think about how you might make your slides stand out from the crowd. So as Jane was saying, they're going to have 2 or 3 days worth of interviews, and that means they're perhaps as a panel interviewing perhaps 25, 30 people possibly. So how are you going to make yourself stand out? Particularly because you're going to be delivering online this time around, I would think about how you're going to navigate the panel around your slides. So how are you going to direct them around what you're talking about? So I don't know if you're like me, but I would often be pointing and moving and using my gestures to show people where I want them to look next. You're not going to be able to rely on any of that because you're doing it virtually. So it's thinking about whether you use different colours for different parts, so you can tell them to look at the red part before the blue part, for example, or however you're going to do it, but you make them easy to see where you want them to look next. The other top tip I think I would say is to anticipate the kinds of questions that you might get asked, and if there's key questions or questions you think might be difficult to answer, think about building some of those into your presentation. So as Jane was saying, that first 5 minutes is the bit you've really got control over. If there's something you think they may misunderstand or you want to get across to them, can you build that briefly into your presentation so you've already addressed it up front, at least partially, and in a way that you've managed to have time to think about beforehand, so you've thought about how you might talk about it. Perhaps easier than being put on the spot and asked a question about it afterwards. Obviously, it's not just what's on your slides, but also what you say that's really important. So thinking, for example, about what's your hook. How are you going to really briefly just sell how important your project is? So if I was to put up a slide with a picture like this, for example, and I was to tell you that 40% of children have had a tooth removed due to tooth decay by the age of 5, I've no idea if that's actually true, but straight away you think, oh, this sounds important. I've not used up very much time, but I've got your attention and said this is an important topic. So how can you do that for your topic? Jane said this too, but I think it's really important to emphasise is be enthusiastic. every time I've had feedback from an interview, whether I've got the fellowship or not, they have always commented on the fact that I've been enthusiastic and passionate, and that tells me that that's something that they're interested in and they think is important. So they're investing in your project, but primarily they're investing in you. So they want to see this as something that you feel passionate about, and think particularly about doing that if you're doing your interview online, because I think it's harder to convey that virtually than it is face to face. Can't say enough, practice, practice, practice the presentation, both the timing, because as Jane says, they'll cut you off at 5 minutes, but also the content in terms of what you're going to say. The more you have that memorised and able just to regurgitate, the more you can focus on the delivery and feel a bit more confident and comfortable. Think about what you're going to put on your slides versus what you're going to say, so how those two things augment and add to each other, so you're not just repeating what's on your slides, but adding perhaps to it. And lastly, if you are doing this online, then really think about how you can use that to your advantage. So I know it might feel like a disadvantage in some ways, but I'm sat here now in my office. I could have things stuck up on the wall around me, so key prompts, key things I want to remember, or key things, questions that I think might come up, and little reminders of that. I'd want to have a pen and a paper ready to write down questions potentially, because that's what they'd give you if you were there in the interview. I'd want to make sure I had a glass of water. I'd want to think about whether I wanted to use 2 screens and have my application or bits of it up on the screen, or perhaps printed off in case I wanted to be able to just look at it briefly. And the other thing I think would be to think about not being disturbed. If you're like me and you've got children at home, make sure perhaps someone's taken them out or no delivery men are going to disturb you, but also practice the software beforehand. So I'm afraid I don't know what software, whether it's Zoom or Teams or whatever that the NIHR are using this time, but whatever it is, I'm sure you'll obviously get told beforehand, but practice, make sure you're comfortable with how to use it, how to present your slides and that sort of thing. If you're not sure about where to get images from and pictures, then you can use something called Creative Commons, just as a useful aside, where you can get pictures that are free to use. The other thing to think about is to perhaps use pictures that you've actually taken yourself as well. The other thing that makes it personal is perhaps pictures of you in work, if you work in a clinical setting, for example, showing the work that you do, or an element of what's really important, so it's not just stock images. And then some top tips for the interview itself. So can't remember if you said this or not actually, Jane, but there'll be 2 people in the panel who will be asking you questions. So it's 20 minutes of questions in total. That means there's roughly 10 minutes for each of those 2 people. One of them is going to ask you questions predominantly about you. So about you as a person, about your career aspirations, how this training programme, how this fellowship is going to boost your career, where do you want to be in 5 years, that kind of stuff. Questions that maybe get a little bit easier to answer because they're more focused on you and where you're coming from, and you obviously know that better than anybody else. The other person will be asking you questions predominantly about the project, and so that's where you need to know your theory and your research methods, etc., inside out. And as Jane was saying, you can look up and see who those people might be beforehand. So it means you need to know your application inside out. Every little thing you could be asked a question about, you need to know about it really. Practice answering questions about your application. So I'm guessing that we all had mock interviews, and obviously Carol and her team arranged those here. That's really valuable. Another thing that I think is really valuable, which I learned from my unsuccessful application this time around, is to ask experts in your field to look over your application and to anticipate questions that you might be asked. So in my interview this time, when I got the feedback afterwards, I obviously knew what questions I'd been asked in the interview, and afterwards I got to see the feedback from the expert peer reviewers. So the applications are sent out to experts in the field to look at beforehand, and they send reviews back with the kinds of questions they would ask and their thoughts on the application. Every single question I was asked in my interview came from those expert peer reviewers. So there were no questions that had been generated by the panel themselves unless they happened to agree with what the expert reviewers had said. All the questions came from the experts. And it meant that although my mock interviews had been really useful, the mock interviews weren't with people who were experts in my area. So actually they weren't any of the questions that I was asked in the interview itself. And I did wonder in hindsight whether I'd sent it to people that actually worked in the field that I was in, whether they were clinicians or researchers, they might have anticipated some of the questions that I was answered. And the other thing to think about is, do you know any panel members? So are there any panel members in your department, for example? I mean NIHR fellowship panel members. Because if there are, they are not going to be able to sit in on your interview anyway. They'll have a conflict of interest. And so even if they're on your panel, they'll have to sit out while you have your interview. So you may as well make the most of their expertise, go and talk to them, let them see if they'll look through sections of your application and see what kinds of questions they think you might be asked. Make the most of that. Here's a few top tips that don't come from me, they kind of come from the NIHR. So I knew that I was going to be doing this evening. So a couple of fellowship panel members that I know, I asked them what would their top tips be for the interview. So they're in 2 columns because that's what the first person said in the column 1 and what the second person said in column 2. So things like that being really engaging, presenting to the room, really listening to what you're being asked. So what questions you're being asked. I found sometimes from the feedback, especially this time around, that I hadn't actually quite answered what they were asking me. Sometimes their questions aren't very clear, and you really need to listen to see if you're answering the question, or maybe check if you're not quite sure, say, is it this you want me to talk about, or is this what you're asking? Because answering those questions well or not is going to make the difference between you getting that fellowship or not. They said it's okay not to know, but to be ready to learn. So it doesn't mean you need to have the answer to everything, but you show a willingness to learn more about that, to say that's really interesting. I wonder then if that means I'd need to think about X, Y, or Z. If you don't know the answer, think about what else you could say to show that you're willing and keen to think about the point that they've made. And to remember that it's not just about the project, it's about much more than that. It's about demonstrating that you are somebody that they should be investing in. And then on the other side there, so someone's saying it's really important to be on top of all the aspects of your application, and they want to, partly they're testing, is it your project? Has someone else written it for you or parts of it for you, or do you understand it and know it really well? Can you stop and think about what the risky bits are? So if there's bits that may be problematic in practice, have you thought about that? Do you know what they are? And have you got a plan B for if that fails? And if you're being interviewed at the minute, do you need to think at all about COVID and whether that has any implications for your project, and a plan B in terms of any elements that could affect? Their advice was also not to spend ages saying how important the topic is. So it might be quite a quick thing that you say at the start, just to emphasise the importance, because you wouldn't have been shortlisted for an interview if you hadn't have already made that clear. And then lastly, the last piece of advice was don't forget something about impact. So obviously that's something that the NIHR is very interested in. What's the patient benefit? What's the ultimate impact of your fellowship and your project? So make sure you've got something about that in there. Just at the bottom, you'll see that I've put something called top tips straight from the NIHR. I happened to come across the other day a video that was recorded from a session that the NIHR ran themselves in London a couple of years ago, which is about a half-hour session that is specifically about the fellowship interview. And so it's got panel members talking about the interview and their top tips. So I just thought I'd share the link because you might find that useful, and they may cover some things that we haven't thought to. I'm going to shortly, Jane, be coming back to you just so you're ready. But what we're then going to see next, as Jane said before, is she's very kindly going to just talk us through her 5-minute presentation, so you can actually see what an actual fellowship presentation looks like. What kind of things do you put in the slides, and what kinds of things do you say? So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and then we'll go back to Jane, all being well. There we go, I've stopped sharing. Thanks, Jane.
Okay. Let's try this one. Okay. So.
I don't know if it works any better, Jane. You know, in the top right-hand corner, there's the square with the little arrow. I've used the share my screen bit, but whichever way you prefer to do it is fine.
Yeah, I was doing the share. Hang on, let me just shut this one down because that probably won't help matters. Let me just. Yes, I'm sharing my screen, so hopefully it should work. We'll give it a go anyway. Right. Are you able to see? No, you're not, because it's flashing at me now. Sorry, I'm just going to start again. Sorry, everybody.
So I think we could probably mention at this point that Jane's presentation would have been preloaded, so she wouldn't have had to go through all of this.
This is true.
And at the moment you would have the so the people are being invited to log on to Zoom, interview candidates 10 minutes beforehand to go through all of this and to make sure that your presentation is loaded up and is working. So you will have that bit to go through, and then obviously you'll be invited to give your presentation aware that you have 5 minutes, and that you shouldn't be going over those 5 minutes. Some of the panels are being given an extra minute in order to be able to include a slide about the impact of COVID. Now that's not happening with the CDRF, but it is with other panels.
Okay, thanks Heidi. Can you all see my slide now? Hooray. Let's see. I'm probably going to go over 5 minutes, but purely for technological reasons. Okay. Thank you for inviting me to talk about my research proposal. Hopefully the next slide has loaded. Has everyone got it? No, oh dear. Right, hang on, we'll go on to it. Next slide now. Okay, so advances in medicine and technology mean that more infants are surviving the first years of life than ever before with long-term health conditions. This very vulnerable set of patients are frequently in contact with the healthcare setting, requiring surgical or medical interventions such as antibiotic treatment, and therefore increasing their risk of acquiring healthcare-associated infections such as Clostridium difficile infection, the leading infective cause of antibiotic-associated diarrhoea in adults. This presents new challenges to our NHS and to healthcare services worldwide, to which we must adapt in order to provide the best healthcare for our patients. We know that C. diff infection is a significant problem in older adults, where risk factors are very well defined, and we know that the disease carries a high cost burden in terms of morbidity, mortality, and healthcare costs. We know a lot less about the significance of C. difficile in infants. There are some reports of increasing rates of CDI in infants, but there are a lack of robust studies on which to build case definitions. This picture is also complicated by the fact that both children and adults can carry C. difficile spores asymptomatically, and carriage rates are particularly high in infants. I'm sorry I'm having to do it like this. Because of this lack of knowledge, we currently just don't know exactly what role C. difficile plays in causing diarrhoea in this group. And both US and European guidelines caution against testing for C. difficile in infants with diarrhoea. This means that currently healthcare professionals don't have the knowledge or guidance to be able to manage these patients in the best way possible. This in turn can lead to inappropriate use of resources, such as costly infection control measures and inappropriate use of antimicrobials, highlighted by Dame Sally Davies as a driver in the global antimicrobial resistance threat. Put together, not being able to deliver the best care for these patients may lead not just to poorer outcomes for the individual, but also to the NHS as a cost pressure and to all of us in terms of safeguarding the future of antimicrobials. The research project that I propose examines the impact of C. difficile on clinical outcomes in hospitalised infants with diarrhoea, or CD-COT for short. CD-COT will consolidate the UK as the world lead in redefining guidelines and establishing best practice for these patients. The programme of work that I propose will first of all establish the current clinical practices around C. difficile in infants. In the absence of any guidance, what are healthcare professionals doing? I'll then lead a multi-centre non-interventional study to look at whether there are any differences in clinical outcome in infants with diarrhoea who are positive for C. difficile toxin versus those who are negative. I already have 4 centres committed to participating in Leeds, Nottingham, Southampton and Great Ormond Street Hospital. Leeds is the lead site and I will perform or the laboratory stool sample testing within the Healthcare Associated Infections Research Group, one of the world's leading C. difficile research laboratories. CDCOT will be guided by my study management group, and progress discussions with my industrial partners will provide a valuable commercial viewpoint on how industry can best meet the needs of the NHS and the public. I will have statistical support via the NIHR Leeds MIC. The study data will determine outcomes in infants with diarrhoea who have versus do not have C. difficile toxin in their faeces. Using a stool diary, the data I will collect will allow me to examine how quickly diarrhoea resolved in these groups, and this will be the primary outcome measure. I'll also look at other measures of morbidity to determine whether these differ between groups. Additionally, I'll use the clinical data I collect to identify possible risk factors based on those already identified for CDI in adults and those suggested to be a factor in infants. And finally, I'll perform detailed laboratory analyses of the C. difficile strains isolated, about which we know very, very little in the paediatric population. What I ultimately hope to achieve is the establishment of new, clear guidelines on C. difficile infection in this age group, not just for the UK, but also for healthcare services worldwide. With the support structure I've put in place from the world-leading Healthcare Associated Infections Group, the NIHR MIC, industrial partners, Leeds University and Leeds Teaching Hospitals, these aims are achievable and would further establish the UK as the leaders in this field. Finally, the training programme I've designed will support both my clinical and research development, establishing me as an international expert in Clostridium difficile infection in a world-leading research group with the platform and skills to influence policy and improve patient outcomes through research. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jane. I don't know what everyone else thinks, but I think that is a really helpful example of the key kinds of things you need to include in a presentation, isn't it? Things around why it's so important, a really clear gap in the knowledge, then a really clear outline of the project itself, and then really clear outputs and impacts from it as well. I think those are the key things, aren't they, really, that you need to include?
Yeah, it's clarity of your presentation and clarity of how you're speaking about it. And, you know, you can't do that first off. You need to use the people around you who are supporting you and the wider kind of academic community to help you really hone that, because you're doing it for the first time or possibly the second time. But you have to have support to do that. It's the best way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the great things that Carol and her team offer, isn't it? That you get the opportunity to practice.
Yeah, definitely.
Brilliant. Shall we move across to some questions? Unless did you want to say any more, Rachel? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, yes, let's do that.
Brilliant. Okay, so if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand and ask in person or virtually in person, or obviously we'll start to answer some of the questions that come down the side. I was just going to, Carol has asked lots of questions which are all very relevant, so I'm just going to start by answering some of your other questions and we'll come back to those as well. Some of the practicalities, first of all, hopefully Maria asked about what you say with the first slide. Hopefully Jane demonstrated that you don't need to give a whole rigmarole speech about who you are and where you've come from, because everybody knows that. So just thank you for the opportunity to, for me to present my proposed fellowship, and then straight on with the next slide, because it'll have who you are on the slide anyway. So now, when I know that when Jane got to her final practice interview, because I was there as well, that she was definitely not reading off the slides that she had by the side of her, and so I think Carol actually asked, will, you know, even though you're doing an interview here on screen, you have the opportunity for things around you. You know, that piece of paper, someone could open a door and that piece of paper blows away. I think for your own confidence is that you need to be able to deliver your presentation in the same way as you would do it if you were standing there in the room as well. So no, I would learn it off by heart. I practiced mine when I was out running. I practiced it in the shower. I practiced it everywhere, you know, just so it was the only thing I could share with anybody. Conversation, anything beyond that became a problem because it was just my presentation and my project that I could talk about the first few days beforehand. The other thing was about looking at the screen. Obviously at the moment we're doing lots of work with people and it's a very new thing, but I think really to make sure that you're looking at the screen, that you're talking to the people, and hopefully the person who's asked the question will be, you know, will sort of come up as a priority box, and so you can do that. Don't start looking around, looking at what's up in the corner, because it really sometimes, or you know, you may have that inclination to look away when you're answering a question, even though you're not intending to be rude. It looks like you're looking at the cat on the floor or something like that. So so do that. So in terms of others, so Hannah has asked about questions about detailed methodology and whether that really an answer could be that it was suggested by your supervisors. And I know certainly in my SCL interview, one of my questions was why I was doing this particular course. And you know, basically the answer was that it had been recommended by one of my supervisors who was a national expert in that field. And so with their support and with the appropriate course, and you know, that's why we've chosen it. And one of the things we try to work around here in terms of when we're thinking about training plan and what you might want to convey in your interview is that actually the training plan is not just going on a course. You usually have got some mentorship or some practice back in your own institution, and the people around you to support you, because you've chosen your supervisors and the experts around you that will support you in sort of really embedding that learning, that formal learning, in everyday clinical or academic work. Remember, you've probably got a clinical and an academic training plan here.
I think if I can just jump in there as well, Heidi. I think you know, you quite often you're putting a team together as part of your, you know, your fellowship, and if somebody asks you a question on a particular methodology, I think it's okay to say, you know, I have discussed this with the team that I've put together, because that then suggests to them that this is a team you are already in the process of building. It's not going to start with the start of your fellowship. You believe in this so much that you've already started putting those building blocks in place. There's not, you know, science and research is all about teamwork. I would certainly not view that as a negative that you discussed it with other people and come to a collective conclusion to put something in your training plan.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the focus. All of these fellowships are training fellowships. So they're all about process of learning at whatever level, whether you're, you know, going for a PCAF or whether you're going for an SCL or even for a research professor fellowship right at the top of the triangle. Marcus has asked.
Can I add something else to that as well? Just I think this point there just sort of touches on something else I felt particularly in sort of my interview, where I think you're quite tempted when you get asked a question, you're not really sure the answer, but it's something simple like, oh, well, my supervisor recommended it. You want to come up with some sort of huge, grand answer that, you know, solves all the questions in the universe. But actually, yeah, especially when you're maybe more junior, because then you kind of feel that kind of inferiority complex as well, perhaps. So, but you really got to just remember that it's okay to say, yeah, it's just this simple answer, because if you try and make it up, they'll see through you anyway. So being honest is really important.
Absolutely.
I completely agree. Just I only say this very quickly, but the times when I've done better at the interview are when I've been honest and when I've said, actually, I don't know as much about that, or yeah, actually, maybe that wasn't such a good idea and I might do this instead. And then the time I didn't get it was the time when I tried to kind of fluff through it a bit more, and I probably didn't do a very good job.
absolutely. So Marcus has asked whether Rachael referred to actually them having lists of questions, the two examiners, from the external peer reviewers, and certainly you may well have an expert in your field on the panel, and that will just be purely by luck rather than by chosen, because the panel are chosen before they know who the interview candidates are. And yes, so quite often the priority is to get through the questions that have been raised by the peer reviewers. And I think one of the things that I certainly found was that there wasn't an awful lot of kind of probing too much deeper. It was like, we've got this question to ask, we've got a certain amount of time, 10 minutes to ask you about the whole of your 5-year fellowship isn't very much. And they will recognise from the peer reviewers that there are specific questions that really we need to just get to ask. And so hopefully there won't be too much more probing unless you start to dig yourself into a really big hole. But usually they will move on anyway, because they want to find out, whether you have an idea about the whole of your project and not just one specific bit. And certainly for me, I can't remember if it was Jane or Rachael who alluded to the fact that you have no idea how it feels when you come out. And I think it's that because you don't get a great, they're not nasty or anything, but you don't get a great response back, and they're asking you a question, you're giving an answer, and you're moving on to the next one. So don't try and dwell on the last question, because it's unlikely to be at all related to the next question, because they're going to have picked questions about different random aspects of your project. They're not going to focus just on one work stream and keep going at you on that one. They're going to pick different ones, because at the end of the day, they need to determine as well if you've actually written this application is one of the things why you're there, because the application form, even some degree your presentation, you may not have had an awful lot of involvement in potentially. So now they need to really determine if it is your fellowship and you've actually been involved with writing it and you know what's going on. So are there any differences to consider between applying for an advanced fellowship versus DRF? I have a DRF and now I'm thinking about an advanced fellowship. So DRF is obviously for PhD level, and I think maybe David might be, you're probably closest to that point. Some of us have gone beyond it, but certainly the DRF is very much focused around your PhD, and I think the PhD is the start, and completing your PhD is the start of your clinical academic career. So David, I don't know if you have any thoughts, as it's probably wavering around in your space at the moment.
Well, I'm not really sure what an advanced fellowship is, to be honest. So I'm going to struggle to answer that. So the advanced fellowships now are sort of anything that's beyond PhD, and the advanced fellowships are actually split into, Carol, you can chip in here if I get this wrong at all, but the advanced fellowships are split into two, a junior one essentially and a senior one, and they are there under the everybody panel. So there are clinicians in there, there are academics in there, there are scientists in there, everybody is in that. On the ICA panel, which probably most of us are concerned with here, it's sort of at the clinical lectureship and the senior clinical lectureship standard. So now there's kind of advanced fellowship is anything beyond DRF. So David, you might be either having a look at those, or you might actually be thinking about a clinical lectureship, or to go down the ICA pathway. Yeah. I hope that so really anybody can apply for any of the schemes, and certainly if you're thinking about combining a clinical academic career, then you certainly want to be thinking probably more along the ICA panel. However, there are obviously all of the doctors will follow the advanced fellowships and will also combine a clinical and academic career. So there is nothing to stop you applying for the advanced fellowships in the same way as the ICA is. So
I think maybe the other thing perhaps useful to say in terms of what's different between applying for a doctoral fellowship and an advanced one is perhaps just what you're trying to demonstrate. Obviously at a doctoral level you're not expected to have as much in terms of research outputs and experience, but obviously that's what you need to start demonstrating when you're applying for advanced fellowships, and particularly if you're applying earlier on. So if you were somebody like David applying fairly soon after doing your doctoral fellowship, then you really need to have outputs from your PhD in place first. and that's publications as first author from your PhD, but also a demonstration of impact before, so that you probably need a little gap, I would say, between one and the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, does anybody have any questions they actually want to ask in person?
Come on. Someone ask us a question.
Just to reassure us that actually somebody's awake and listening to us. We're quite happy to talk to ourselves, as I think you discovered right at the start as you were joining us. Oh,
Kerry's got one.
Oh, go for it. How do we? I think you can
I didn't really have a question, but I thought, seeing as you want somebody to talk, I'll talk. So let's bring up COVID. It rules some of our lives at the moment, particularly mine and Jane's. And so in the interview pack that's come out for the CLs, it suggests that you should only include a COVID slide if you think there is absolute impact on your project, and there isn't any extra time allowed for that. So you've still only got your 5 minutes. What does the panel here think that sort of considerable impact from COVID looks like? What should we consider? And when should we say, do you know what, I'm just going to leave COVID out completely and just leave it to the questions part at the end?
So I would certainly suggest that you might want to give a nod to it if it's going to have any impact whatsoever in your presentation. So we've just had somebody who was interviewed for the DRF. I doubt Lara's with us because hopefully she's kind of having 5 minutes out this evening and not thinking about anything to do with applications or fellowship interviews. So she was on the DRF panel and had a whole slide included, which was obviously was much easier to do. Now, working with some of our CDRF applicants for this year, to give you an example, that we have somebody who's got 3 work packages, and the 3rd work package potentially will have a COVID impact. And so it's not about including anything on the on the slide, but just sort of giving a nod to it, acknowledging that the outcome of the project will not be affected by COVID. So what is actually creating in the end won't be be affected by COVID, but some of the methodology might be that gets you there, but that that will be taken into consideration. So I think it's just for the sake of sort of maybe 10 seconds, adding an extra sentence, I think, if and particularly, I guess, Kerry, in an area like you're working in where it's going to have an impact and potentially could do for a number of years going forward. So that would be my thoughts.
Thank you.
Maybe on the other end of the scale to that as well. So I think a few people spoke to me recently and said, something on COVID, I'm going to do everything online. And it's like, that's good, but if that's all it is, then you do not need to mention it, because so it's just common sense, there, isn't it? Really, if that's the impact.
I would say, like, one of the things that we've been talking about is whether to change all your PPI and stuff like that to doing it online, and you have to be careful about switching everything to online, perhaps, because we will emerge from COVID one day, and hopefully in the duration of some of our fellowships. So in those cases, some face-to-face meetings and actually going to conferences and stuff will be possible. So, that's it's not necessarily a case of turning everything onto an online way of doing things.
Okay, so I think Angela Bergin has her hand up, or I saw it flash up. I don't know if she still does. Angela, are you there?
I am. Hi, Heidi.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. Thanks ever so much, guys. What a great presentation. I just wanted to say, and even just hearing you guys speak, there's something about the command of the language and being able to formulate answers to questions in a really articulate way. And I think as a clinician on the ground, there is something about developing that language. So I'd applied and got to interview stage last year and wasn't successful, but between then and resubmitting hopefully next year, have been trying to find ways to help with that, so understanding a bit more about research methods. But I just wondered if you had any other tips. So I have joined a research group at the university, but if you had any other ideas or tips around, I suppose, developing just general understanding and language in response to the questions. It just seems like an art form somehow. I don't know how you do it. It's just...
One of the things that really helped me, and this won't be for everyone, but it might help some of you, is I sometimes do open mic nights, and learning to be in front of an audience and knowing it's going to be okay after the first 10-15 seconds. It's all right, that fear is going to go. Helps you be able to formulate response, because you learn to kind of control the fear. So I guess putting yourself in these uncomfortable situations more than perhaps you would like to is probably one of the things that's going to help you learn to deal with them.
I mean, hindsight's always a wonderful thing, and certainly I can look back at where I've failed and where I've done better, and the times when I've done better, there's usually a reason, because everything, all of the pieces of the jigsaw are together, and I think I can look back and think that actually something about that project, that training plan wasn't right, and therefore I was never probably going to be successful. And so I think when something does come together and you've got all of the right pieces, and you know, these are such big fellowship applications that it's not a bad thing to, you know, for it to be wrong and for you to, you know, to get it wrong and to not get it the first time. And I think what I'm trying to say is that when everything is right, it gives you that confidence at the time when you go into the interview. So I went into my senior clinical lectureship sort of knowing that I had brought what I felt was the best team together. I had put the right training plan in place, and, you know, the iterations that had gone through, but having that experience beforehand to know kind of what works and what doesn't. So I think some of that confidence that we maybe show sometimes is only because of how good what's behind us and supporting us underneath is. And so I think, you know, it's not always about what you have to learn, it's about what's supporting and underneath, if that makes sense. I hope I've kind of explained. So when everything's right, that will give you that confidence to move forwards. But if there is some doubt, you know, I've been in positions where I've not felt confident that I don't know what's wrong, but I'm not sure that it's right either, and then it's not worked out. So and I think maybe Rachael alluded to that a little bit earlier, where she said she was trying to fluff through things. Sorry to use that term, it's not very technical, but actually, you know, that was when she wasn't successful. Whereas when she knew what she knew and knew what she didn't know and was able to share that, then, you know, that gave her the confidence as well.
And I think the other thing was just that being honest thing about, if something, you know, no application is going to be perfect. There's always going to be things that, you know, that you get picked up on, or that perhaps could have been done better if we all had a million years to put these things together. And I think it's the times when I've gone, actually, yeah, you're right, that could have been a bit better, and it would be really important to think about X, Y, or Z. So it hasn't been that I had to have had the answer always. It's being confident enough and comfortable enough to have kind of, I remember sitting there in a dilemma thinking, oh God, they have picked up a hole, and they suggested one part of my project is not really worth doing. What do I do? Do I defend that, or do I go, actually, yeah, you're right? And I went, yeah, I think you're right. And actually, I think that is really what they wanted, is to think differently about that element of it. And the second time around, I tried to defend why something was the way it was, and I don't think that worked as well. I think they want you to show that you can change and adapt and be flexible and think about, you keep developing things as you go along. Someone asked before about if there's things that you realise could have been better, and I've definitely heard them say before, you know, if you have in the meantime realised something could be better, they want to know that, because it shows that you have spent more time thinking about your project in the meantime, and it's what they're looking for. I wonder if some of it's a test of you sometimes.
I'm very conscious that it's 8 o'clock, and Carol has already given me a warning about not letting it go too far past 8 o'clock. So, but I think just to pick up on that last point about what Rachel was saying, and also that's I think Carol had put a question about what sort of, you know, arguing with your examiners. The last thing you want to do is to have a full-blown argument with your interviewers, your examiners, whilst you're in the room. And I think, you know, you have to remember that the time from when you submit the application to the interview is a long period of time, and so things may well have changed. So to acknowledge that either, you know, they actually might be giving you some helpful advice, and so to acknowledge what they've given to you, and to acknowledge that something may have changed is absolutely right to do.
Completely agree.
Can I just jump in with one just on that last? I know we're running over.
We're going to have lots of last points.
It's going to be just, Angela, I think you're talking then about sort of communication really as well, isn't it? Communicating ideas. And I think like what's really important in this process is sort of finding your voice. And I call it my NIHR voice. Like I'm a physicist, and communication, not our strong point. So, you know, for me, that was really important. And the way I found that is, you know, write down all the questions you think you might get asked, and then come to a very clear understanding how you're going to approach each question, you know, in terms of how you're going to answer it. Like you've got so many thoughts, like what shall I tell about the really important bit? Do I need to tell them all the different things I think are important? You know, so for me, it'd be like, you know, I'd have 3 key points that I want to express, and I pick the 3 most important things, and I'd say all of them, and then I'd maybe elaborate if they wanted to ask more. So that's sort of just on how you're going to attack the questions, where maybe not attack, but politely answer the questions. I think it's really important to find that voice, and that'll give you confidence going in that you have the right tools to kind of answer any question.
And if they say, if it's a really good question, then say it's a really good question. You know, it's promoting discussion. You know, it's they're interested in your project, so you know, saying to them, gosh, that's a really interesting point, I hadn't fully considered that, and then you can, you know, talk about it a bit.
Absolutely. And I think you know, remember when you turn up to your interview, and if you want to, all the help is there beforehand. You know, certainly I know there are lots of people who are outside of Leeds who have joined the conversation as well this evening, but I'm sure you have the same support locally, is that actually, you know, use those people around you. You know, if you use what's on offer, I know David, I'm sorry, I'm not going to single you out, but I remember like your first practice interview that you did with Carol and I, and the difference between that and when you went to your interview was just phenomenal.
Yeah, the nightmares of that still haunt me. It was just the shame I felt after that session. But then I found my voice, and you know, you turn it around. You just got to keep practicing, haven't you?
Absolutely, and there are always people to help you. So I am going to draw this to a close now, but